Hello, everyone. I'm Nancy Eames. Thank you for joining us for our first Authors Program of the year. We are so appreciative of your continued interest in hearing great stories from great authors, and are especially thankful that you've decided to join us here on these new platforms. We are also so grateful for the generous financial support from our presenting sponsor, the Library Legacy Foundation. Gifts to the foundation allow the library to remain a constant and positive force in the community. Thank you as well to our presenting media sponsors, The Blade and Buckeye Broadband, our supporting sponsor, Viewer Group, and our community sponsor, Friends of the Library. Their support helps make these programs possible. As we continue to navigate these ever-changing times, we are updating our programming model. You can find all of our online programs at ToledoLibrary.org. We've got Saturday morning story times and programs for kids, adult book groups, and special events for teens and tweens as well. Check out ToledoLibrary.org for more information. This program is being recorded tonight, and the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. We have staff monitoring the Facebook Live and the Zoom chat functions, so please send in your questions. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of the event. So let's move on to the event. I am pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, our Executive Director, Jason Kuchma. He is a born and raised Ohioan who returned to Ohio in 2015 to assume the role of Deputy Director at TLCPL and was named the library's Executive Director in August of 2019. Welcome, Jason. And now, just a bit about our featured author for the evening. For nearly 2 decades, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Connie Schultz has charmed readers with her nationally syndicated column and her critically acclaimed nonfiction books, Life Happens and His Lovely Wife. Critics have celebrated her work, describing it as evocative, engaging, and intelligent and affecting. Turning her eye to fiction, her debut novel, The Daughters of Erietown, follows Ellie and Brick, 2 teenagers in love. As a basketball star, Brick has the chance to become the first person in his family to attend college. However, when Ellie learns she's pregnant, Brick gets a union card instead, and Ellie gives up her dreams of nursing school. As the role of women evolves over the next 5 decades, the frustrations of deferred dreams and unmet desires engulf their lives, revealing the secrets at the heart of a family. Connie is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and a professional in residence in the journalism school at Kent State University, her alma mater. She lives in Cleveland, Ohio with her husband, Sherrod Brown, and their rescue dogs, Franklin and Walter. They have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. Please welcome Connie Schultz.
Thanks, Nancy.
My pleasure.
Welcome, Connie. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
So good
I'm
to see
excited
you.
to be here. Thank you. You too, Jason.
Last time I saw you, you were here at our McMaster Auditorium with your lovely husband promoting his book. And I would love to have you here today in our auditorium today, but we can't. So this is the second best way to get some time to hang out with you. So thanks for joining us.
Sure. And thanks to everyone who's watching us tonight, right? Thank you to everybody who's tuning in.
Indeed. As Nancy mentioned, we'll be monitoring the chat and see if people have any questions for us. But just so folks have an idea, and just we'll have a conversation here for 20-30 minutes or so and open it up for questions. And I'm just delighted to spend some time with you. I follow you on Twitter, and I find you both humorous, thoughtful, sensitive, and of course intelligent. And it's nice to be able to chat with you. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
You and I share at least one thing, which is we both grew up in Northeast Ohio. I grew up in Willoughby, just a little bit west of Ashtabula.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I left there when I was 18 and haven't really been back a whole lot since then, but I've found roots back here in Northwest Ohio. So we're still on the lake, right?
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about the genesis of this book. So obviously you've had quite a career as a journalist, and this was a bit of a departure for you to think about writing a novel. So can you talk a little bit about that?
It was more than a departure. It's not even a pivot. I liken it to leaping off a cliff. But as I always tell my students, if you're never scared, you've stopped growing, right? So I think I'm having a really big growth spurt right now because I'm a little scared. When my second book was about to come out in 2007, my editor at Random House, Kate Medina, asked to have lunch with me and made the pitch. And she said that the working class are really underrepresented in modern literature. And I couldn't have agreed more with that. Coming from the working class as I do, and loving fiction from a very young age, I couldn't help but notice that there were very few families like ours, very few towns like ours. When working class people showed up, they were either rather oafish, they were a device, or they were romanticized beyond recognition. And while I agreed with her that this was a need in literature, I didn't quite catch on at first that she thought I could do it. It took a while for me to believe that. It does take some time, at least it took some time for me, especially because I had such reverence for good fiction. Right? And that was the only kind of fiction I wanted to attempt to write. And it took a while for me to believe I could do it. And then once I really got into the rhythm of it, it's not coincidental that I'm a working class kid who grew up in a small town in Lake Erie, and Erietown is a working class town on the shore of Lake Erie. So obviously some of that of who I am, and certainly the hearts and souls of a lot of the people I've known over the years, particularly from my childhood, but even in my own neighborhood where I live now, they certainly inhabit the book in various ways.
When you say it took you some time, what does that look like? How
well,
long
it looks
did
like
it
a
take you to
decade.
Is that, yeah.
Well, the second book came out in 2007, so you tell me. I mean,
There you go.
It took a couple of years for me to even start thinking about it seriously, but Kate Medina would not give up on me. And then several years into the process, Gail Ross became my agent, and she was just as enthusiastic about it. And they're both tenacious women. This book would not exist without them, because they would not let up. They would not stop believing I could do it. And something clicked over time. And anyone who's written fiction, or perhaps many who like fiction, will understand this. At some point, the characters start taking up residence in your head. And they're going to rattle that cage until you let their stories out. And that's when I found that the process really started to work for me.
Excellent.
And I know how weird that sounds.
No, I'm assuming they're still living there, right? Those characters are still kicking around.
Occasionally, right.
What, for those that have not had a chance to read the book yet, it just came out recently. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about Daughters of Erietown?
Well, Nancy was right to give the sort of brief synopsis that she did. It's a lot about hopes and dreams of the working class, because I know this, as does anyone who's come from the working class, that we have our hopes and dreams too, and we have our aspirations. And the difference between working class people often and more affluent, luckier people, I often think of them, is that when the big problems come and we don't have any money to fix them, and that can certainly derail the dreams of people, but it doesn't change their aspirations. They just invest them in their children often, which is certainly one of the sub-themes of this novel. And I also really love women's stories, and I know how seldom women tell their stories. And I've been talking about this some since the book came out last Tuesday. And it occurred to me, and only after I started answering interview questions, that it occurred to me that that too has driven this novel for me, because I've done so much public speaking over the last couple of decades. And when the room is full of women, when they are most likely to respond emotionally by nodding their heads, many of them tearing up, is when I ask a simple question: how many of you have ever told your story, even to the people who think they know you best? And the answer is seldom. Women often don't feel entitled to do that. And so this book is also the story of women's lives. And I've been so touched increasingly by readers who are men and women who are reading it, but especially the women, of course, who are sharing more of their stories, or the stories of the women in their lives who came before them after reading the novel. And that is, as I just said on Twitter this afternoon, that is a novelist's dream, to be hearing from readers and hearing such personal response, just about train cases alone, because the train case becomes somewhat important in the book. And people are sending me pictures of their train cases. And also, I just want to thank all of you readers out there who've been sending me pictures of you holding my book, or having it on your bed, or on your table, or just arrived in your mailbox. I had not expected that, and it's just been so wonderful to see that kind of enthusiasm, and that they know that I want to see it. I'm glad that they know that this is something I love seeing.
that's incredible to get that sort of immediate gratification, that
Oh,
immediate
goodness.
meaning it, over a decade in the making, and then and of course publishing a book doesn't happen overnight either. How is that different from being a columnist and a journalist? What kind of the feedback or the sort of gratification that you get from readers reading your work?
Well, I love my readers. My career would not exist without readers, and that's why I've been particularly happy to see so many events being scheduled in Ohio, because I am that native of Ohio, and that will never change. And you always care what the home folks think of you and the work you're doing. So in that way, it hasn't been that different. I'm always hearing from readers, but the amount of personal responses I'm getting so quickly, and from many who didn't know I was a columnist. I mean, I didn't know this either until I was interviewed and asked about it. There are readers who've been familiar with my work for a long time. There are readers who never heard of me until I came out with this book or didn't know much about me. And so I like introducing them to my work as well. Writing a novel is so different. When you reach impasses, when you start to struggle with what comes next, you can't pick up the phone and interview somebody. You can't flesh out the column, right? It's all happening up here and in your heart. And so that took a little bit longer for me to get used to. But again, it's also somewhat freeing. I've been quoting May Sarton a lot, the late poet, and she published a lot of journals. I read all of them. She said, only in fiction, perhaps, can you be totally honest. And I'm starting to understand more and more what she meant by that. It's not that the journalism is dishonest, but as I tell my students all the time, you can't say someone thinks something or believes something. You can only say they believe this. They say they think this. In my book, I know what everyone's thinking, and it's been quite liberating to write about it.
That's fascinating. I had not thought about that as they say they believe this thing. Interesting. We do, a lot of people have appreciated the fact that you've written this novel. They appreciate it as a reader, but I know that a lot of people tune into some of our author events and show up to our author events as aspiring authors or authors who are just really, really working at their craft. You came to this as a journalist with a relationship with the publisher. And you mentioned earlier the idea and the importance of women telling their stories. What kind of advice would you give to sort of a novice, someone who's coming along, who doesn't have the kind of background that you do, who's still working on what could be the most important story that has yet to be told?
Well, I want to emphasize, first of all, that I didn't come from influential roots. And I say that not defensively, I say that to everyone who's thinking, oh, I don't have a publisher, I don't have a journalism career. There's a lot I didn't have either, but what I did know about myself is that I had to write. And if you're really if this book is in you, if this story's in you, and you really keep trying to figure out a way to write it, that means you're meant to write it. And there is no substitute for the discipline of writing. I am not a morning person in that I am definitely not my husband. I don't wake up chatty. I want to dart out the door ready to greet the world. I have to do that a lot, but it's not my first choice. But I do find that I write better in the mornings. And so my ritual, whenever possible, has been to get up by 5:30 or 6, have coffee and a little bit of breakfast, and then I go sit in my sunroom, typically is where I work, and I light a tea light, because that candle will burn between 3 and 4 hours, and I set that as my goal for how long I'm going to be working that day as a minimum. But another thing that can be very helpful, that Thridi Umrigar, the exceptionally talented novelist, shared with me years ago, well, actually only 2 years ago when I was getting stuck, write 1,000 words a day. If you can write 1,000 words a day, you're going to get to where you need to go. Is all of that going to be golden? But of course not. But I'm used to that. I know I've done a lot of, especially narrative journalism work, and I know the first draft is never going to be the final draft. But it gets you where you need to be, because so much about writing is a process, and it is a head game. You have to tell yourself, at least I did, I would quite literally, I talked about this when I was a young journalist. I used to look in the mirror and say in the mornings, you are a journalist. Because I started to understand that the first person who really had to believe it, because I always had the naysayers around me, women always do, right? I had to believe in myself. I have found that to be similar for myself. When I first started being called a novelist in the last month, I teared up the first couple of times. I thought, I haven't actually called myself that. I'm a writer and I've worked on this novel, but now I am a novelist too. And I understand the leap of faith that requires in a person. But I'm here to tell you that there is no substitute for the discipline of writing, and the discipline of writing will get you there.
Even if you have to throw those 1,000 words away at the end of the day, right? You've written those
That's
1,000
exactly
words.
right. Well, and it's the process. I mean, I have been known, I remember in choir in high school, you would say, when you don't know the lyrics, if you forget them, start singing watermelon, watermelon, water. Well, sometimes I would sit at that computer and type watermelon like 18 times. And all of a sudden I'd think, oh no, this is where I want to go with this. I do have another tip that I have found very helpful over the years. End in a place where you know you want to start the next day, so that you don't have that reluctance to get to the keyboard. It just really is a head game again. But if you think about, oh, that's right, here's where I'm going to go next. And often I'll write in the morning and then read in the evening what I've written to get a sense of it. But I don't edit as I write too much. I mean, certainly I'll start moving around paragraphs as I go, but I know that I'm going to go back. I'm going to fine tune this. I'm going to look for word repetitions. I'm going to make sure that the person she was this age at the beginning is still that age at the end. If she's reminiscing about something, there's a lot of chronology in this book that took some time to make sure I got right. But trust your instincts, create first. Keep creating, and then you go back to the editing process, which I enjoy, actually. I really enjoy the revisions. It gives me a chance to really craft it in a different way. I have the anxiety is past me. Now the anxiety is beyond me because I've gotten out that first draft. And let me tell you, I mean, when I wish, I can't believe I never looked up how long a first novel is supposed to be, or any novel. So I turned in 197,000 words, and my editor very kindly said, as she sent 10 pages of notes to me, single space. On the phone, she said, "Now I do want to tell you that most novels are usually about 110,000 words." We got mine to 122,000. So I really had to cut out a lot. I don't regret writing that way. I can guarantee you my next first draft is not going to be that long.
Yeah. How was it to get those 10 pages of notes?
Well, I have the best of the best. I have Kate Medina. Yeah. She's just edited some of the giants in the industry. And she was right most of the time. I mean, I didn't agree with everything. She never makes it in order, but she was so right about so much. And for those who've read the book, Rosemary comes later in the book than she did originally, because it's a new character who's going to have quite an influence on the McGinty family. And she said, let's really get to know Ellie and Brick first, and then let's introduce Rosemary. Another thing she taught me very early, to look for balance of characters. We have certain primary characters, and she said, count the number of pages each of them has right now. And it really helped me understand who needed further development as characters. And interestingly to me, probably only to me, is she thought the most fully developed character in the beginning, when I first turned in my draft, was Brick McGinty. Was not any of the women in the book, it was Brick. And I've thought about that a lot. And I think part of it was because I'm not a man, I worked harder to try to get that one right. I interviewed utility workers, because he is a utility worker, as was my dad. I ordered, old manuals, for union manuals from the 1960s to understand the messages they were giving to the workers in terms of safety issues, but also they had a whole separate thing with diagrams. Here's how you make electricity, which ended up leading to Brick sitting down at one point at a table and drawing on a napkin for his children how he makes electricity. Because Sam, his daughter, much like I thought when I was her age, thought that her father just sent lightning bolts to the outlet, and that's how they got electricity. I never had the scene where my dad explained it, but I thought, well, now that I know that I can see the diagrams and stuff, how would a man who works at a plant draw in a way that his young children could understand it? So it just evolves. You do a lot of research for a historical novel.
And one of the questions that came in from our viewers was, when you say you're cutting words, are you cutting storylines, parts of storylines, characters? And you mentioned Rosemary being sort of something that got deferred or sort of pushed back a little bit.
She wasn't different. She just becomes a prominent character later in the book.
Later.
And we really get her backstory then, before she intersects at all with the McGintys, which was important to do. Mostly it was scene cutting, a lot of scene cutting. And so you have to decide what scenes really pull along the narrative and which are just scenes because you kept imagining all these different ways that the characters could interact with one another. For the character Ellie, for example, I could cut a number of scenes where she was interacting with members of the public, including at the hospital where she worked, because I figured out another way to show her job. And in fact, there's a chapter in the book where Ellie, frustrated that she thinks nobody really cares what she does for a living in her family, she sits down and makes a list. And that list is a partial list of my mom's list. as a nurse's aide that I never saw until after my mother died, and my sisters found it. I don't know why she made so many pages of that. It haunts me a bit that I don't know why she did. She had enough for all of us if she was going to, every member of our family, it looked like. But I wrote my column about it. It's the only time I'll mention my book in a column. But I wanted to explain, if my mom and my dad were alive today in a working age, they would be essential workers because she was a nurse's aide and he was a utility worker. And I just thought my mom was not alive for me to ask why she made that list, but I could at least share a little bit more about why she did what she did with the general public. And that's how she made it into the book.
That's excellent. And you mentioned, and we talked a little bit about this at the top, but the sort of lack of representation of working class in popular culture. Where do you think that's being done accurately right now? And where did you turn to sort of places to sort of see where that's being done well as models, perhaps?
I certainly am a fan of Richard Russo, for example. I think he does a wonderful job often of it, but I didn't look to other writers. I looked deep within myself. What are the stories that I would like to tell? And of course, at the very beginning, we excerpt from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. And there's a reason for that, because it was the first book I ever read where I thought I saw people, including a little girl who could have been like me, knowing that she was smart, but misjudged by many or judged harshly. Many thought she was invisible because she was a working class kid. I certainly knew that feeling growing up. I was just talking to Shara this morning, we were on a walk, and before he left for Washington, I said, I didn't realize how often I was not allowed to go to someone's house because of what my dad did for a living. It came later that I started to comprehend that. If the father worked at a bank, was an insurance, fathers who wore ties to work. We're not as crazy often about having kids like me playing with their daughters.
It's amazing. You wrote this book over the course of many years, but I'm wondering how that book would be different if you were writing it right now. I mean, we're in a very different time, just even within the last 6 months, than we were at the end of 2019. Do you think that the themes are so universal that it would not have changed much, or do you feel like where you are right now as a writer and just experiencing the world right now would have changed the way the book evolved?
No, I don't think I would do it differently, because at its core, this is a book about dreams and about broken hearts often. It's about secrets. And those are universal themes that never go away in families. And so often what we aren't willing to share is this really the reason we end up being misunderstood. And I try to show that as well. I'm working on my second novel now. I would not attempt to address the pandemic yet, or what's going on in a long overdue, I would say, the attention that we're now paying to what's happening in the streets in America. Because it's, first of all, as far as, I've written about racism all of my career, and certainly during my almost 2 decades now as a columnist. But there are a lot of writers out there who are not getting this opportunity yet, or who are about to get the opportunity. And they are, especially women. I would love to see more Black women and Latina women being able to tell their stories. There's certainly, race plays a role in the Daughters of Erietown. There is racism there. And there's a generational divide between a daughter and her father, which I certainly grew up with, and I understand that. One of the themes of this book, to me anyway, and when I was writing it, is our roots are our beginnings, but they are not our excuses. And part of what's been driving that is this national narrative, unfortunately by some of my fellow journalists, that if you come from the white working class, well, you have to be racist because that's what you come from. And I just say baloney to that. We reach adulthood, and we decide who we're going to be. And it's no different from any other population. You decide what you're going to believe in. And I wanted to be able to illustrate that a bit through the book. It's not uncommon that it's between generations, of course. That's where the tensions so often come to the front.
Our roots are our beginnings, but not our excuses. When you said that, and I think I read that in maybe a column of yours or somewhere else, but it just really stuck with me. It's really fascinating. It gives people the freedom to kind of step back and examine their sort of assumptions about the world and the way they act and the way, and it gives them permission to change, right? It also
gives them, I hope, the courage to speak up, even in the most intimate of settings with family and friends and colleagues. You know, we have a lot of work to do as white Americans, and then one of those things we must do is take that stand very publicly, very certainly. It's time for more people to be willing to make others feel uncomfortable.
Agreed. I will make a quick plug that I just sent out a note to our community here that encouraging everyone to read the new Jim Crow, which is now available from the library for free for everyone, unlimited access. So I'd like our communities across the country to be reading that, and especially.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's a great book. That's a wonderful book too.
I have not had a chance. I have not had a chance to read that yet. So
that's Michelle Alexander, is it?
Indeed. Yep. Michelle
Yes.
Alexander and Overdrive, which is based in Cleveland, our big audiobook distributor. They're the ones that negotiated that for us. It was really pleased to be able to offer that to everyone, knowing how important it is to read that and other titles right now. Can we talk a little bit about how? Well, I want to talk a little bit about journalism right now. And I know this is about your book, but your life as a journalist informed this book to some extent. Talk a little bit about that as your, as a lens that you looked back at you writing this book from a journalist perspective.
Well, I've been a journalist for more than 30 years, and I love being a journalist. Writing a novel has been a real leap of faith for me, but it doesn't mean I'm leaving behind my journalism roots. I couldn't possibly. It's who I am at this point. And it certainly has informed my work. I did a number of narrative series, which takes the fiction writer's tools to tell a nonfiction story. And that was under the direction of my editor, Stuart Warner, at the time, who was just an outstanding editor. And so I brought all of that training to the writing of the book. And I remember when I did a series called The Burden of Innocence, which was about a Black man named Michael Green who had been sent to prison for 13 years for a rape he did not commit. And when he got out, I spent the next year with him telling his story and going back in time. We had to, I had to reconstruct a lot. And one of the best pieces of advice he gave me is he said, look, you know how to write essays, you know how to write shorter stories, write this like chapters. And so when I was approaching my book, I've had a number of readers say, I'm so glad you have shorter chapters. And I'm a big believer in chapters, partly because how I read. I really appreciate that a book, I can put it down at the end of a chapter if I have to get to something else, or it has a beginning and an end in each chapter. If it's done well, it's a narrative within a narrative, which I really appreciate, in which I've done a lot of as a journalist. So there's no way I could abandon my roots as a journalist as I was approaching this. It also probably made me a little bit better on deadline than some who've never been journalists, because the best definition I ever heard of column writing was that you sit under the windmill and you get hit in the head and you think, God, that's over. And it just keeps coming and coming because you're always on deadline, right? So I'm very accustomed to being on deadline.
Yeah, I've sat under that windmill before. Journalism is in a tough space right now. Where do you see hope in journalism? And I asked that because a local journalist here just recently did a really fantastic piece for The Blade about, and it was connecting I Can't Breathe with both the pandemic and this anti-racist movement against police brutality, and knowing how important, and we are very fortunate here to have local media, local journalists who are showing up to board meetings, those boring board meetings, and showing up to the important places where they need to be to tell the community stories. Where do you find hope in our journalism right now, in that field?
Well, part of where I find it is in the young people I'm teaching. I don't think we can talk about the state of journalism without talking about what Donald Trump has been saying about journalists, because that's the climate we're in right now. It's not a partisan issue for me to say that it is really wrong to call journalists the enemy of the people, and that the American public should be very concerned if a president wants you to think that about us, because the ones he's calling that are the ones trying to hold him accountable, and that is our job, right? I started, I'm a professional resident at Kent State, my alma mater, in the journalism school there. And I started in the beginning of 2016. So it was only my second semester when the election happened. And I will never forget going in the next day. It was like triage. I had a line of students out of the door and down the hall, and many of them were not even my students. but they wanted to talk about what had just happened because he had already been calling us the enemy of the people. He had already been encouraging his crowds to become, mobs, taunting and threatening journalists at his rallies. What I love is how quickly they pivoted, and it made me think of why I got into journalism, which was during Watergate, right after Watergate, in Woodward and Bernstein. This is a far more serious situation, but they have pivoted so quickly into understanding anybody who would call them the enemy of the people is exactly why they should be doing this, because their work matters. I also think our younger journalists are going to have more solutions, and how do we make it financially viable still? And how do we get the American public to care about what we're doing? I want to thank all the people, including those who might be watching tonight, who still support journalism. I know you're out there. I hear from you all the time. It is so important. I worry that only recently many have come to understand why it matters so much when we've lost so many local reporters. But quite frankly, a lot of newspapers, most newspapers got it wrong when they started giving away content for free when they started posting on the web. That was one of our biggest mistakes, and people came to expect that they shouldn't have to pay for it. I don't think journalism is dying. I think we're in a time of real change for the profession.
Yeah, and that's why I asked you about hope, because I don't think it's dying either. I think it's still vibrant in many pockets of this country, and we need those sustainable models where we can grow that future, the future talent, and that promise that you're just talking about. I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Maron. He's a comedian but podcaster. He always used to ask stand-up comics who are primarily male at a certain time in this interviews, but he would ask, who are your guys and who are the people that you look to as comedians growing up? Who are your people? Who are the men and women who are writing before you that really influenced who Connie Schultz is as both a journalist and a novelist?
I would cite where I went for my reading. I mean, I've loved Paris Review for so many years. I've loved the New Yorker. I started reading the New Yorker as a kid in Ashtabula because a doctor started giving me his copies. And I was 17 when I started reading it. I think reading good writing is important, but to name just a few writers would be so hard because I love reading, particularly people I haven't heard from before. I certainly have the ones I depend on, but that list keeps growing over time. And I love being surprised. I like reading about things that I think won't interest me, but I trust the writer. So I'll read it. To me, the most important thing has been reading. And in terms of fiction writing and essay writing, I talk a lot about Grace Paley because I discovered her in high school. And here was this Jewish New York woman writing about working class people in a way that made far more sense to me than all the white male readers I was having to read in high school. There were so few women that we were reading. And then I discovered Toni Morrison, and I discovered Lucille Clifton, the poet. And when I was going to school in Ashtabula, and a lot of people don't know this about Ashtabula, but we do who grew up there, half of my class was Black all through elementary school. And then even more so often in junior high school, depending on what your courses were. So I grew up understanding that my closest friends didn't have to look like me. They had to be like me. And, so it's much more of a heart-to-heart content. So of course I was looking for other ways to understand the world because my world was growing, even from my experiences growing up in that small town. And when you're when you're the first in your family to go to college, which I was, and this is certainly a theme in the book, those who get to go to college will straddle two worlds for the rest of their lives because your parents and your relatives can be so proud of you, but they're also worried that you're going to forget who you came from or that you're going to feel you're too good for them. And so you're always trying to aspire to make them proud of who you are, but to keep them connected so that they don't feel like you're abandoning them. And the tension is real. I certainly felt that throughout the time that my parents were alive.
Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that came in from our Facebook viewers was a list of recommendations for young women specifically, and you gave a few of those already, which I think, are there other authors you think younger women should be reading right now that you didn't have a chance to mention just now?
Well, there's so many women. And again, I hesitate to offer a list because then I'll miss women and I'll think, oh man, especially friends. But there's so much out there now. It's so much easier to find out. I don't know how many are following me on Facebook or Twitter. I share links all the time to stories I'm impressed by, books I think people should read. And I work hard to make sure it's inclusive. I don't want to just share stories by men and books by men. There are some very fine male writers, that's a given. But what I want is to broaden the audience and to broaden the number of readers who or excuse me, writers who get a chance, because we need more voices, and we particularly need more women's voices.
It's interesting you mentioned, that the perspective of growing up in Erietown, Ashtabula, and how our worlds have become so much bigger now, especially younger readers, writers, and how their worlds are no longer necessarily bound by the geography that they live in.
Right.
And so much more.
But that was
potential.
true. That was true when I was a kid, because I was reading books.
Fair,
It was how I traveled, right? Burlesque Buck. I mean, there was so much to read, to learn about the world at large. And I loved, I came from a county that lost 26 boys in the Vietnam War. So one of the most meaningful books for me in the 70s was Michael Hare's Dispatches. And I did I forget if it's called Second Pass or Second Look, for Columbia Journalism Review a few years ago. They asked us to read and write again about a book that mattered to us. And that was the one I picked, because I will always read about the Vietnam War. Until I went to Kent State, and this is true of Sam McGinty because it was my experience, I didn't meet anyone who didn't know somebody who had served in the war. And that's when I became aware of the class issue for Vietnam, right? And the race issue, who was serving and who was not, who was getting out of having to go and who didn't have any shot at that at all. And so it has so informed who I am as a person. So of course it should inform who I am as a writer, right? And I was able to read so many of those books also in college and beyond. So, and I don't just read women by any stretch. I think I'm often, when I started out in journalism, I was determined not to be that so-called woman's writer. I wanted to be a writer, a woman who was writing about everything, because women care about everything. And I wanted to show that through my work.
We had a viewer who I think speaks to a question that or something you just mentioned. She loves your views on diversity and loves how inclusive you are, but how do you make sure that you are not yourself living in an echo chamber? And I think that that's something that we all struggle with, and
yeah, sure,
we gravitate towards people that are like us, right? But how do you balance that?
Well, I live in the city of Cleveland, and so most of my neighbors don't look like me. That's a start. I drive through Trump country every time I go to Kent State, a portion of it, but I'm also related to Trump voters. I mean, I'm never going to get away from that. And I think it's a really important question. Sharon and I have this rule for ourselves that when we're out in public, we belong to the public. And before the coronavirus, I always do my own grocery shopping, pick up my own prescriptions. I go out into the world pretty regularly, as does Sharon, of course. And we feel so strongly that that is the way you stay connected to people, including those who don't agree with you. All I have to do is go to a Target in Streetsboro to meet people who are not going to agree with me as we're standing in line. But I love to start a conversation. I love to hear what's on their minds. All I have to do is wear my hoodie that says America needs journalists, and we're going to have a conversation when we're waiting for the checkout. So it is intentional, though. It's a good question. You must be intentional, because it's easy to be in this world that we're in and isolate ourselves so that we don't have to deal with that, right? My Facebook page is public for a reason, so that it's not just liberals weighing in. I would argue that I wish we had more conservative people weighing in. We still get them some. I won't at all tolerate trolls, as anybody who follows me knows that. But I do try to engage with people who may not agree with me. I think the best way you start out with that is, why do you think that? Why would you say that? Not if it's racist or homophobic, not if it's, well, the list. But if it's an honest disagreement or critique, I'd love to hear what's on their minds.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned, so Facebook, certainly the technology limits our ability to get outside of that echo chamber. So your examples were the Target line, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, how do we have those? We don't have enough of those conversations with our neighbors and with our fellow community members, because we live in, technology pushes us into that sort of illusion of connectivity, but it's also that sort of a little bit of isolation. One of our viewers asks if let's take a turn. We'll sort of turn back to the book a little bit, because people have a couple of questions about that.
Okay.
You mentioned, obviously, your personal history influences the book. Are there characters in it that are based on people that that are people that are familiar to your family that
I would say no. I mean, there's certainly parts of my parents in Ellie and Brick, but they diverge pretty quickly from who I knew them to be. There are little knots, like Clayton Valley is named for my grandson, Clayton, our first grandchild. because when I was first writing it, he was the only grandchild we had for 5 years. There's a character named Lenny Klaczynski, and Klaczynski is a nod to Sherrod's best friend, John Klaczynski, who died shortly after Sherrod was elected to the Senate in '06, and it was a devastating loss for both of us. And so you have these little nods that you can. I have Reverend Lubinger, which is a nod to my friend and former play dealer colleague, Bill Lubinger, because he used to sit next to me. So you get to have those fun little moments. But for the most part, these people are entirely fictional. And that's the challenge of it is, I mean, they certainly have the hearts and souls. Parts of those hearts and souls are from the people I knew and who I grew up with and who I know now. I mean, I know a lot of union people, for example, and I know I've spent most of my career as a journalist interviewing people who normally don't get attention, right? So it's a lot of working class people. They've all crept in different ways to create these characters who are only make-believe to me now because they don't exist in real life, but they're certainly real to me now.
You were first-generation college students, and we had one of our viewers is also a first-generation college student. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between your first-generation college students now and maybe your experiences?
It's not that different. That's the thing that really gets me. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to go back to Kent State, 2 reasons. I went there, but I want them to see it really worked out for me. They can come, they don't have to go to the Ivy League to have these careers that they can love, and they certainly don't have to go to the Ivy League to become writers and journalists. But I also went there because a certain percentage will always be, at least right now, first-generation college kids. And I want them, you know, one of the first things I do is I always ask, show of hands, how many of you are? And it is really moving to watch their faces. Sometimes it's the male students, so you can see their eyes mist up when I say to them, you know, you're supposed to be here too, right? You belong here too. We're going to do this together. And when I see some of them and the challenges they can have with families who want them to go to college, but have no idea how to help them get through it. And when they start to struggle, I've seen this, and I'm glad I've been able to be there to talk them out of leaving, because their parents will say, well, maybe you're not cut out for college. No, this is what it feels like when you're a junior, or this is what it can feel like when you're, you know, trying to get ready to graduate, and it's scary, and you've got how many more credit hours you got to go. It helps to have people who've been through it. And I want to be there for them because there were certain people who were there for me, and it made all the difference in the world for me.
You mentioned earlier that you're hearing from women who are glad to hear these stories being told, and they are holding up pictures of your book. Have you heard from other folks, maybe from other working class quote individuals who are talking to you about your portrayal of them in that book, and thinking about how, you know, not to essentialize necessarily, you know, working class folks, but what themes are you hearing from them, or what kind of sort of resonance?
Well, I've always said to myself that if this book doesn't ring true for people with working class roots, I will have failed. And so it has been extremely rewarding. That's early, but I'm starting to hear more and more stories and how they feel like it's got parts of their own lives in it, which means I'm hitting upon universal themes. I've also been surprised by the number of men who've thanked me for not making all the men horrible. Why would I do that? You know, you're sometimes you have to defeat the stereotypes you didn't even know existed about yourself, perhaps, or the worries they might have. You know, I can be a strong woman and really like men who like strong women, right? I understand that there are good men out there, and I've been a little surprised by that, but it's also been pretty rewarding because part of it's just it was unexpected. And I enjoy hearing the stories that they tell about their own fathers then often. I'm in the early days of this yet, but I can't tell you how much it's meant to me to be hearing from readers. And I'm easy to find. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, my Gmail is public, so.
Well, I would encourage you all to follow Connie if you haven't already. Well, let's assume, as you said, if this book is a failure, it is not a failure. Let's assume it's a success. People are already asking, will there be a sequel, or what is the next novel you're working about focusing on?
I am working on a second novel. I'm already at work on it. It is not a sequel. I do anticipate, but I wanted to see how readers responded. I certainly have ideas for a sequel, but I think it'll probably be the third one if I'm going to do that right now. And the second one, I'm really mapping it out right now, and I don't want to talk too much about it because I don't want to give too much away, but I am pretty happy about where it's going right now. I feel pretty good about it.
That's excellent. How long do you think it's going to take you?
Not 10 years. I've set some goals for myself.
Yeah. As a fellow Midwesterner who is at least tangentially connected to Cleveland, why is Cleveland so misunderstood?
I don't know. I mean, part of it is because Clevelanders have so often been so defensive about their city. I've never shared that. I've always felt, I mean, I was accused once by a guy who grew up, a friend who grew up in a very affluent family. He said, you know, you are a reverse snob. You think working class people are superior to everyone else. And I couldn't deny it. I wouldn't say superior, but just we're smarter than you think we are, right?
Yeah.
I would say that about Cleveland as well. There's always been this defensive nature about how we feel about our own narrative. I've never felt that way. And when I was at the Plain Dealer, I'd often get, you know, not often, but occasionally get interviewed by a paper in Baltimore. The Washington Post would call, why did Cleveland? And I said, I'm not the one you want to talk to because I think we're great. I think we're smart. We are so diverse ethnically as well as racially. Do we have our problems? Sure, of course we do. But I love this city. And it's my adopted hometown. You know, I was from Ashtabula, but Cleveland was always the big city for us. And I love being here. That's why I live in the city. I love this town.
Truly. And, you know, as a Midwest booster myself, you know, we can sometimes get in our own way, right? As Midwesterners, we kind of want to be a little defensive maybe, or sort of not acknowledge how great it is here. And I'm thrilled to be back in Ohio and to be able to, it was a little sheepish for me to leave and come back, but I'm back now. So
you're back. You came home. Who's complaining about that?
Exactly. Thank you so much, Connie. It's been a joy talking with you tonight, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope that everyone takes a chance to pick up your book from a local independent bookstore, or if not, to check it out from their library. A lot of libraries in Ohio now are doing curbside service, including